Where do we get our concept of right and wrong, our moral code? Freud's worldview says that they just come through human experience, through expedience, what works, what doesn't work, and it's been developed over time, whereas Lewis gives a long argument to show that this is indeed like laws of mathematics that we discover rather than make up, and that it transcends time and culture.
Something is directing the universe, and it appears in me as a law urging me to do right and making me feel responsible and uncomfortable when I do wrong. In the moral law, somebody or something from beyond the material universe is getting at us. God is the impersonal mind at the back of this law.
The ethical commands to which a religion seeks to lend its weight require some other foundations instead. A human society cannot do without them. But it is dangerous to link up obedience to them with religious belief.
If no set of moral ideas were truer or better than any other, there would be no sense in preferring civilized morality to savage morality, or Christian morality to Nazi morality.
It would be an undoubted advantage if we were to leave God out altogether and recognize the purely human origins of all the precepts and regulations of civilization.
What are your reactions to those statements?
To me is that it's both and. There's religious instinct, there's spiritual experiences, we have history behind us, we have civil codes, moral codes, we have all kinds of stuff that come at us from all different levels of consciousness. For me, you turn this around and these two things go directly together like the two sides of a magnet.
So you're saying that this could indeed come from God, but it would be reinforced, observed, and reinforced through human experience.
Well, I think
is that what you're saying?
You could put it that way, or there could be more of a dialogue, kind of what to do. And clearly, we don't know what to do yet because this world's a mess. So it's not like there's one answer that's the right answer, and we just haven't. You know, if we all just went to it, we'd be okay.
Let's take one question. What is the origin of the moral sentiments? So they evolved through natural forces and culture and history, or God implemented,
Why can't it be both?
How can it be both?
How can it not be both?
Unless you want to just say the forces of history and nature is God's way of doing it.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
But
it doesn't sort of add
God
much.
works in
it doesn't
history.
add anything. It just
Why not?
It just adds a word to the system.
No, it adds. No, I don't agree. I think it adds an element of our humility. I think it adds an element of the unknown that we, no matter what, we don't know. We don't know.
Well, another thing that I think it's important to be clear on is that the moral principles of a particular religion may be true from the standpoint of someone who's secular, but for different reasons than merely the fact that they were promulgated by God. I.e., you can reject the Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Buddhist arguments about creation and about the existence of God, but yet buy in almost entirely to their moral conception, but not necessarily because you think it's divinely inspired, but just because there's a lot of wisdom inherent in these belief systems, because lots of smart people spent lots of time thinking these things through, articulating the principles, and look, they've been successful. Mm-hmm. Like, look,
you're saying that they come from human experience over time. Is that right?
Well, I'm saying that's a possible argument.
Yeah. But I think
I'm sorry?
It's a possible argument. And you would agree with that. You would say that they do mesh with human nature,
right,
but precisely because the Creator envisioned this for the species. I might say, well, just naturalistically, this has come to be, and it is good for the species, and these principles are good principles by which to govern our lives.
My sense of morality comes from a community dealing with certain historical issues, and you know, in particular, the situation of African Americans in this land, and that helps determine what the work is. That determines what, and from those past experiences, we learn what is right and what is wrong.
But what if I came to you and I said that I believe social justice really, it's an unworthy cause. I feel that the earth has only limited resources, and therefore we should maximize the use of those resources in certain ways that will allow the ultimate achievement by the human race. I mean, that's an old philosophy that unfortunately was adopted by the Nazis.
A type of manifest.
Yes, a horror, right? And yet, without a conception of God, how do I explain to someone like Hermann Goering or Adolf Hitler that this is immoral?
I don't think God would have been much help convincing Hitler or Goering of anything.
Well, wait a minute.
we don't wanna
Wait a minute.
convince
Wait a
him.
minute.
We just wanna shut him
I'm just saying. Let's stay with this question. A very simple question, and it says, without an absolute standard on which to stand, how is it that one human can say to another, what you are doing is immoral? Do you say, okay, what you did was wrong only for practical reasons, as Freud would say?
No, not just for practical reasons, because you wouldn't want to have it done to you.
But regardless of whether it's done to me or done to anybody else.
Isn't it a better principle that of how you'd like to be treated versus, because God said I shouldn't do it.
The golden rule.
So,
Yeah, I think the golden rule is far superior to any theological God told me this was bad argument.
well, wait a minute. The golden rule
Is religious.
is from God.
I think it's evolutionary. I think its origins is evolutionary.
The first statement of it is in.
I don't care what religion said about it. I think religion got it from our evolutionary history. I think in a social species, this is the first rule, the first moral rule. Since the Enlightenment, we have values that we put on human life and freedoms and civil liberties that have nothing to do with religion, and they don't come from religion. And we enforce those. We run around the world overthrowing dictators because we want to help people and because they're people. Just because that, and that's good enough.
But that's being challenged in fundamental ways. As a former diplomat, these ideas have huge consequences, and that came out of a worldview that said there is evil, and part of our mission is to confront that.
The other side to it is that, I mean, I absolutely agree that there is evil. I mean, that's a real thing. But to say there's evil out there, you know, to project all the evil out there and to say I am the good and therefore I'm going to, but that's the underbelly of this worldview. And I think the idea of tolerance, when it's a profound idea, has to do with, wait a minute, before I accuse you, you know, I have to look at mine. And then if I see what that instinct is, then I can talk to you about it, but I can't just squash you.
I think that's the fear with absolutism that, Margaret, you were referring to, the idea that what I believe is right. And because it is absolutely right, I have the right to impose it on you, to force it on you. And if it means that I can go around, as certain elements in the world do, and claim that as part of their religious mission they need to kill certain people, then it's justified, right? So clearly that's a very dangerous ground to stand on. On the other hand, this notion of tolerance I find equally intolerable. The notion that sort of all versions of truth are equally valid.
Okay, let's think of it between the relativism of all views are equal and the absolutism that there is one right way. There is what I call provisional morality. That is, there are principles that are true most of the time for most people in most circumstances. Tolerance is one of those. Most of the time in most circumstances, tolerance is good. Not 100% of the time, though. Sometimes you just have to be intolerant. You take the knife away from the baby, you don't allow them to jail people, whatever. And so what's the principle there? What's the guiding principle?
Right.
Well, we can start with the golden rule. We can start with freedom, greater freedoms for more people as a guideline.
Why is freedom a good thing?
Well, because we've decided that since we each individually would prefer freedom versus less freedom, that as collectively as a group, this is a good value to have.
I don't know why you necessarily need God in order to have morality, which is, I think, what's at stake in this discussion,
What are
if
the
I understand
criteria?
it.
Let me give you an
Is that
example
right?
of why I think
You seem to be
occasionally-
saying earlier that you needed God to have a sense of right and wrong.
Well, let me tell you
But I don't think you do.
practically how I think this works. In 1833, the British Empire abolished the slave trade.
Right.
47 years earlier, a young member of Parliament underwent what he referred to as the great change. He went from unbelief to belief. In his diary, you can see in William Wilberforce, in 1791, he wrote in his diary, October 28th, God Almighty has set before me two things to do, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners. But the thing that I found really interesting, he was able to transcend a cultural captivity, if you will, of young parliamentarians of his age. And I would say, Jeremy, that my view has been, if you look over the past 2,000 years, repeatedly people of faith have been able to transcend their times,
Right.
look at a reality and address it.
Right.
And I find that a very powerful argument for being able to somehow see the world differently. And that's what I believe this transcendent set of values can do.
Wait a minute.
Marx and anarchism, I mean, all of those things have provided that same sort of transcendent force. I mean, so it's not just
But I'm
religion.
saying real change, real
Yeah,
cultures.
but the slave trade
the
was justified biblically.
Of course it was.
And when you look back,
But
you say, oh, well, they were wrong. How do you know they were wrong?
You think they were right?
Because our society has decided that slavery is bad, and they didn't decide that because of God or any biblical thing. We decided it because as humans, it leads to lesser freedom, and the Enlightenment values that more freedom is better prevailed. Because people said, we're not going to put up with this anymore.
Right,
It has nothing to do with God or the Bible.
Well, wait a minute. Let me ask a question.
thought
Do you
it-
think the people that were enslaving others, or the Nazis that were murdering millions of people, do you think that they, at some level, knew that what they were doing was wrong?
They may not have, and the reason they may not have is if they based their positions on flawed premises. But if you correct that error, then presumably their beliefs change. And similarly with slavery, there's a belief in, some people tried to justify slavery unsuccessfully on the grounds that there was a difference between the races. But that's false.
Well, they did it for a long time. They were able to justify it.
Right, but that's false. So there is no justification.
Say with the Nazis, though, that developed this theory of, do you think that they really believed that underneath? That these human beings were...
Today, in terms of the incarceration of African Americans and Latinos, I mean, there are people that believe that young African American men are dangerous and criminal. I mean, look at the prisons now. I mean,
And that's just false.
yeah,
Right,
I
and
mean,
it's false.
and people believe it. So, but obviously, if you see who's in the prison, obviously there's something horribly wrong with the society. And many of these people that are putting people in prison and writing the laws are quite religious. So,
Yeah, but I'm not saying whether they're religious or not. I'm asking whether or not, at some level, they know that what they're doing is unjust and wrong.
Well, why is that relevant as a question?
Why is it relevant?
Yeah.
I think it's very relevant because it points to what we're trying to understand here about one worldview, and one of Lewis's main arguments for the spiritual worldview is that there is in everyone a basic understanding of what is right and what's wrong, that's just there, that transcends time and culture.
My father is here with a very old friend of his. In this picture, neither of these two men knew that they were photographed. That is why the whole thing is so natural.
The 1930s would be the last decade of Freud's life. He already had cancer of the mouth, and he knew it would kill him.
My father and mother.
Freud's daughter, Anna, looks back at the family home movies.
This was at the time when we couldn't leave Vienna anymore in the summers because of my father's illness. And so we took a house in the suburbs, and my father enjoyed the flowers so very much.
He's an old man. He's extremely sick. He's had cancer for decades, and they've been cutting on him for decades. And he's got this huge implement in his mouth that's covering the opening in his palate so the food that he eats doesn't come out of his nose. I mean, he's in terrible pain all the time.
Freud knew that he was dying, and I think that led him again to consider the attitude towards death, which he had written about before, Thoughts for the Times on War and Death and so forth. And of course, concern with death, disappearances, run right through Freud's writings from the very beginning to the very end. He would even say to Ernest Jones, "Goodbye, Jones, you'll never see me again." So it was a preoccupation that he had. He was superstitious about the date of his death for years through his life. And I think that as death approached and became a reality, he again tried to understand what is the meaning of death. And of course, one of the wishes that's involved is a wish for immortality, a wish to not die, along with a wish to be relieved of the suffering, a wish to die. So I think that absolutely preoccupied him.
It is the day of my parents' golden wedding. And now you will see a whole string of visitors, people from the country, a little girl. This is one of my father's sisters, one of those who died in concentration camps. Meet Sie, Freud.
Hitler had been elected chancellor in Germany. When the Nazis started burning books, Freud's were among the first consigned to the flames.
Gegen seelenversetzende Überschätzung des Triebslebens, für den Art der menschlichen Seele. Ich übergebe dem Feuer die Schriften der Schule Sigmund Freud.
What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages, they would have burnt me. Nowadays, they are content with burning my books.
It was the tidal wave of anti-Semitism in Germany and elsewhere in Central Europe that brought Freud back to confront the historical phenomenon of anti-Semitism. Why was it such a continuous and pervasive poison in the history of the West?
In the summer of 1934, Freud began to work on the last book he would write, Moses and Monotheism. In it, he would turn his attention once again to religion, this time the Jewish faith.
Freud has a long affair with Moses. Long before his last book. He went to Rome. He spent days sitting in front of Michelangelo's Moses to study it. That this is not Moses in anger, but Moses in trying to restrain his anger.
Here was Freud arguing that much of what we identify as Israelite religion in the Torah actually is of Egyptian origin.
Moses was not Jewish, but a prominent Egyptian who led the Jews into freedom, and he gave them monotheism. In other words, it was not God the Father who chose the Jews, but Moses the man.
Moses leads the Jews out of Egypt into the desert. But then Freud departs from the Bible.
He gave himself a very interesting freedom. He says this is not a scientific study. It is a novella, a short story. I will try on some of my ideas and play with it.
In Freud's version, the Jews follow Moses into exile, but they do not accept his revolutionary new belief in just one God.
They revolted and threw off the burden of a religion that had been forced on them. They took their destiny into their own hands and did away with their tyrant. They assassinated Moses.
Moses' ultimate triumph is assured by the manner of his death. The people of Israel are overcome with guilt at what they have done, so they internalize everything that they had rejected while Moses was alive.
Freud goes on to reinterpret the crucifixion in terms of Jewish history.
Guilt has to be relieved. You can't walk around forever burdened by excessive guilt. So Christianity provides humanity with a way of relieving guilt. The murder of God's Son is a sacrifice that atones, not for the eating of the apple in the Garden of Eden, but for the murder of the primal Father. So Christianity offers relief from unbearable guilt. And Judaism rejects that offer of relief. The world repays Judaism with eternal hatred. That's Freud's deep-seated psychological explanation for anti-Semitism.
Freud is identified with Moses, who brings the commandments, who preserves the tablets of the law, and who brings not only a new set of regulations, but a new way of understanding human nature to humanity.
The thing that is most significant for a reader of the Bible or anyone who knows the story is that there is no God to tell Moses what to do. Like Freud, Moses tells himself what to do. He is his own man.
But historic events forced Freud to stop working on the manuscript.
Now this is already Hitler in Vienna. That's our house looked with the swastikas on it.
In March of 1938, the German army occupied all of Austria. They began the systematic persecution and deportation of Austria's Jews.
Oh, and that is the crowd cheering Hitler. Look at the crowd. That's how it looked.
It was an extraordinarily disturbed period. People were refugees on the move all over the continent. He clearly didn't appreciate the monstrous nature of the brutality that the Nazis had in mind. He didn't foresee that the burning of the books was a prelude to the burning of people.
Finally, Freud saw the danger and allowed friends to buy the visas that would permit him to leave with his family.
We are waiting more or less patiently for our affairs to be settled. In view of the little time we have left to live, I fret at the delay. Anna's youthful vigor and optimistic energy have fortunately remained unshaken. Otherwise, life would be difficult to carry on at all.
We left Vienna by a night train and spent a day of rest in Paris. My brother Ernst, who came to Paris to meet us. My father hoped to see something of Paris again, but he was too tired from the trip.
Here is a man facing death in exile, like Moses leaving Egypt. And he will not get into the promised land. He doesn't really believe that there is an afterlife. He faces death with an attempt again to review his own line of reasoning, the question of whether one believes or disbelieves in a paradise and a heaven, a hell, and a life after death, in immortality. And he rejects all of that for him on the basis of the perpetuation of childhood fantasy into adult life. He thinks that this is not realistic and that one should face death stoically with a realization that that is part of life. It's the end of life. We do not know why it was designed this way, that life should come to an end.
Once established in London, Freud published Moses and Monotheism. The book outraged both Jews and Christians. Though old and sick, Freud was as defiant of his critics as he had been throughout his life.
He's in England. He is suddenly freed from all of the constraints of that public face that he had to present in Vienna. And he can do things that, in a sense, he wants to now do as a public figure. At the same time that he writes Moses and Monotheism, he writes an open letter in English against the persecution of the Jews. Does he do it as a Jew or as a scientist or as a psychoanalyst? At this point, he's all of them.
Now, this is definitely a birthday. It's the last birthday.
Freud usually wound the clock in his study. He had not. He was too sick. And Freud knew that his time was up. The end was very near.
Our unconscious does not believe in its own death. It behaves as if it were immortal. We cannot imagine our own death, and when we attempt to do so, we can perceive that we are, in fact, still spectators.
He faced a great deal of pain and suffering with as minimal treatment as possible, because he was always concerned that it might interfere with his thought processes. He didn't want to be in a state where he might be logy, lethargic, dazed, unable to concentrate.
I cannot face the idea of life without work. What would one do when ideas failed or words refused to come? It is impossible not to shudder at the thought.
All of a sudden, he has to come to terms with this new life, and he does it remarkably. I mean, it's an enormously productive moment given all of these other constraints. And his arrangement, of course, with his physician was that if he was no longer, this was an arrangement that went back to Vienna, he was no longer able to deal with the pain of the cancer, he would be given an overdose of morphine, which at some point he decides he actually needs.
My dear Sure, you remember our first talk? You promised me then you would not forsake me when the time had come. It is only torture now. It no longer makes any sense.
He had all his antiquities with him, all his gods that he talked to, and his personal intellectual life there with him. It is my personal conviction that the ghost of Moses, it was saying to him, come on, have the courage to get rid of God to the very end. And he died as self-possessed as he has lived, not asking for consolation, not asking anyone to protect him, but simply dying as he had lived, with this kind of rebellious defiance and conqueror's stance.
Now that is when 3 men of the Royal Society came to present the book of the Royal Society for signature to my father, because he was not well enough to go there. And I think on that same picture is the signature of Darwin. That was a very nice moment.
By the 1950s, C.S. Lewis had become a famous figure and the most popular spokesperson for Christianity in the English-speaking world. Living and working in Oxford for over 30 years, he was content and had no plans to change.
He was a bachelor, leading a chaste life. There was no reason for him to think he would never be anything other than celibate. Warren was never anything other than celibate. And, of course, when Joy Davidman came along, kismet.
Joy Davidman was a writer, a novelist and a poet from New York. She grew up in a Jewish background, and she came across the writings of C.S. Lewis when she was an atheist and a Marxist, and started corresponding with Lewis.
She told Lewis in her letters that she had embraced the Christian faith in part because of his writing.
Lewis got lots of letters from eligible ladies wanting more than just advice about Christian problems. Why would Joy be any different? Well, she was different. She was different first because she was very, very smart. She knew Lewis's work. She was a poet herself. She was a novelist herself. And she was his match in what Owen Barfield called dialectical obstetrics.
Lewis married Helen Joy Davidman so that she would not be deported. But as they became closer and closer friends, they fell in love.
When two people who discover they are on the same secret road are of different sexes, the friendship which arises between them will very easily pass into erotic love.
At the time they were married, Joy and Lewis knew that she had bone cancer.
I am very shortly to be both a bridegroom and a widower.
Lewis turned to a former pupil who had become a priest, Peter Bide.
Peter Bide comes to the hospital, and Lewis asks if this man, who has some reputation for possessing a healing gift, would place his hands upon Joy and pray that she be healed. Peter Bide does this and lays his hand upon Lewis, who prays that he will get the pain that Joy is suffering, because the pain is ferocious. And of course, Joy is expected to die within a day or two. She doesn't. In fact, she starts to get better within a few months. X-rays show that her pelvis has grown back. The bone has regenerated. Doctors cannot explain this.
After her remission, Joy moved into the Lewis home with her two sons, David, 11, and Douglas, 13.
I never expected to have in my 60s that happiness that passed me by in my 20s. For those few years, Helen and I feasted on love.
Her great otherworldly ambition in life was to go to Greece. She'd wanted this since she was a young girl. They went to Mycenae, they went to Crete, they went to Rhodes. Joy climbed all the way up to the Acropolis. It was a wonderful bonus, and it was one of the happiest periods of Lewis's life.
But the cancer returned. Joy and C.S. Lewis were separated by death on July 14th, 1960.
God. God. Why did you take such trouble to force this creature out of its shell? if it's now doomed to crawl back, to be sucked back into it? Where is God? What pitiable cant to say she will live forever in my memory. Live. That is exactly what she won't do. What's left? A corpse, a memory, a ghost. 3 more ways of spelling the word dead.
A Grief Observed is Lewis's description of the journey he took after Joy's death, a portrait of grief and a struggle with his own faith.
Talk to me about the truth of religion, and I'll listen gladly. Talk to me about the duty of religion, and I'll listen submissively. But don't come talking to me about the consolation of religion, or I shall suspect that you don't understand. The conclusion is not, so there's no God after all, but so this is what God is really like. The cosmic sadist, the spiteful imbecile.
He lashes out at God, and he says, how can you expect us to live this way? Very much like Job. Very honestly, he doesn't just argue. He emotes. The whole of his being is there in front of God. It's a deep trust in God that allows him to give vent to his distrust.
From the rational point of view, what grounds has Helen's death given me for doubting all that I believe? Should it, for a sane man, make quite such a difference as this? No. And it wouldn't for a man whose faith had been real faith. The case is too plain. If my house has collapsed at one blow, it is because it was a house of cards. Indeed, it's likely enough that what I shall call, if it happens, a restoration of faith, will turn out to be only one more house of cards. Something quite unexpected has happened. It came this morning early. Suddenly, at the very moment when so far I mourned Helen least, I remembered her best. Imagine a man in total darkness. He thinks he is in a cellar or a dungeon. Then there comes a sound. He thinks it might be a sound from far off. Waves or wind-blown trees or cattle half a mile away. And if so, it proves he's not in a cellar, but free, in the open air. Lord, are these your real terms? Can I meet Helen again only if I learn to love you so much I don't care whether I meet her or not? When I lay these questions before God, I get no answer, but a rather special sort of no answer. It is not the locked door. It is more like a silent gaze, as though he shook his head, like peace, child. You don't understand. How wicked it would be if we could, to call the dead back. She said, not to me, but to the chaplain, I am at peace with God. She smiled, but not at me.
2 years after his wife's death, C.S. Lewis began to have problems with his heart. He fell into a long coma and then unexpectedly recovered.
It would have been a luxuriously easy passage, and one almost regrets having the door shut in one's face. To be brought back to life and have all one's dying to do again was rather hard. I would like everything to be immemorial. To have the same old horizons, the same garden, the same smells and sounds, always there, changeless. Autumn is really the best of the seasons, and I'm not sure that old age isn't the best part of life. But of course, like autumn, it doesn't last.
Clive Staples Lewis died 3 years after his wife, in 1963.
Can you not see death as the friend and deliverer? It means stripping off that body which is tormenting you. What are you afraid of? Has this world been so kind to you that you should leave it with regret?
How do you equate an omnipotent, all-loving being with what we've come to expect and experience in our lives? How do we cope with the problem of suffering?
There is no solution to the problem, period. There's nothing more to say. There is no solution.
What do you mean, no solution? I don't know. We're looking for a solution. You mean a reconciliation?
Yes, there's no reconciliation. I think the definitive explanation is, as far as from the spiritual worldview, is what was said in the book of Job. And this is a book that I cannot understand, and there is no answer to it. There is a wager.
And God's a sadist in that.
Exactly.
God's a total sadist.
Okay, there is a wager between God and the devil. Okay.
And we're back into dualism.
And the wager is, Job only obeys you because you've blessed him. And God says, fine, torture him, devil. Do everything, but you can't kill him. And so he's tortured to the extreme, loses all his children, wealth, gets boils. And at the very end, you know, when his wife is telling him, curse God and die, he says, no, I will remain faithful. Okay, but he still wants an account from God. Why are you doing this to me? I have not been sinful. I have not committed anything that deserves this.
So why do you believe?
I'm sorry?
So why do you believe?
Because, as Lewis says, faith, the problem of pain is only a problem because one believes in the spiritual worldview. In other words, faith creates the problem of pain.
Right.
So just get rid of the faith and that's it. There is no God.
Then there's no problem.
Which you then go back and logically try to justify, although you
I don't justify the problem of pain.
Yeah,
I'm angry about the problem of pain, as you can tell.
Yes.
It's a horrible concept, and it's one that I cannot reconcile logically with a loving God. I cannot reconcile it.
Huh. You should be an atheist. You really should. You should try it, just for like a year and see how it goes. Because, you know, seriously, you'd be fine.
Hell,
you'd be fine.
We're not going to have any proselytizing.
He's the only one at the table.
How about change it? I believe in free will. I have no choice.
So what theory of the universe makes most sense given the data? If you start with the premise that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and benevolent, and then you run up against the data that bad things are happening to good people for no particular reason, it seems as though you can't reconcile the data to your theory.
I don't think I can know what I really believe unless I'm challenged and face something that's beyond my capacity to deal with. Those moments when I've had periods like that, it really has, in a funny way, been strengthening to me, because I say, you know, it's great during the good times, but during the challenging moments, you know, when friends are going through a divorce or they lose a child, and it does matter what you believe. It absolutely matters.
One of my children got cancer in perfect health. I just got a call from college one day. And it was such a horrible experience. I mean, it's much more horrible than getting it yourself, because there's nothing you can do. And the thing that amazed me about it was that in my worst moments, I realized that I still thought that life was beautiful. And that I still thought that in some way that I couldn't see then, things were all right.
That God is ultimately good? Is that what you're concluding?
That the difference between us and God, the test, I can't think of any other way of expressing it, that Job had, was, are you willing to because you have, if you're a person of faith, you have a good experience of God. You've experienced the sacred in some meaningful, positive way, or you wouldn't be on this path to begin with. Right. So for that person, are you still going to believe the positive stuff when some negative stuff happens to you? That's the issue.
Let me just ask one quick question, though. Did you feel during that experience, like what several people here just said, that God is a sadist?
No, because my God is not up there and I'm down here.
Oh,
God is right here, right now, in some way. God is, one thing we know about God is whatever you think God is not that. God is deeply mysterious and is somehow here right now in everything with us, so that when my son and I were agonizing about what he was going through, God was agonizing with us.
Now, how do we resolve and come to terms with what Freud called the painful riddle of death? Freud makes the interesting observation that our unconscious does not believe in its own death. It behaves as if it were immortal. Perhaps Lewis would say that our minds refuse death because death was not part of the original plan of creation. Does our worldview actually help resolve this problem? And how does this work in terms of people whom you've seen in your own family or your own friends end up their lives?
Well, it absolutely affects your life and the way you deal with death. Because if you believe in the life after death, then it's only a temporary goodbye, not a permanent goodbye.
Right.
So that's very comforting. So I could see it being incredibly comforting, and that's precisely Freud's argument. That's exactly what we'd wish it to be. And therefore, it's not surprising that people would come to believe in this sort of thing. Now, if you don't believe in an afterlife, as I do, I'm not sure what I believe. As I say, I'm agnostic. I don't believe in an afterlife because I've seen no evidence of it. It makes death frightening. And I'm afraid of dying. I'm afraid of dying because of the unknown. I don't know what lies next. I also know that if I die, I won't be able to see other people. I suppose I wouldn't know the difference, but if people around me die, that could be it forever. And that's obviously extremely painful. And I don't have something to latch on to say, well, you know what, could be a few more years and join them in a better place. It might be it forever.
Since I don't believe there's an afterlife at all, that this is all there is, that, for example, when my mother was dying, and it took her like 10 years, she had these brain tumors, kept taking them out, they kept coming back, and this went on and on for 10 years, she finally succumbed. You know, I felt from the moment this started happening, well, you know, since I'll never see her again, and she's not going anywhere, and neither am I, this is it. Every single moment I could have with her, you know, and everything I could say to her that was loving, and every time I could spend time with her, all that just to me was incredibly enhanced by the fact that there is nothing else. And I feel that way with my daughter too. It's like, you know, you think about your daughter going to college or whatever, forget that. I'm just happy to see her the next day and the next day and the next day. Every day I can have with her is just incredibly rich because of my worldview. It's not that people that are religious can't feel the same way. They do. It's just that's how mine informs me.
I don't look forward to an afterlife. I don't deny that there might. I'm assuming that this energy that I live in, this libido that exists in me, is released into the universe and continues life. I mean, the energy doesn't disappear. And my experience working with dying people over the years in the hospital is that there is energy that leaves. I've seen it. I've witnessed it. It's not just, there is then just a corpse, but the life force moves. I've seen it move out of bodies. I mean, there's energy, it goes somewhere. So my feeling is I have no idea.
I don't use afterlife. That's not part of my concept, but I do believe in a conservation.
What does that mean, conservation?
I think that matter is conserved, energy is conserved. Folks who I have loved who have died, their influence stays with me. I hear their words, I see their work, I see the influence that they've had on so many people, so I realize it continues.
In memory, you mean?
Or more than in memory, it's real. I mean, I think of, you know, writers, you know, people like, you know, Toni Cade Bambara. I mean, her words, the way she animated communities as a cultural worker, that stays with me.
Isn't there a difference between memory that goes on and existence
but
in another?
It's the energy. Our lives have been changed as a result of people that have gone through it. And to me, that's the continuity.
Fred's a physician and a scientist. What are your views on this?
Well, I mean, I think if you don't believe in an afterlife, then you have two ways of facing it. One is it's extinction, no big deal. You regret it, you know. You may fear the process, certainly, of having to endure the pain and leaving your family and your loved ones. Or, you know, you may have that lurking fear that maybe Lewis's worldview is correct and that you might end up in Dante's seventh circle, you know, and that's a cause for fear independent of other things.
Yeah, no, we haven't spoken much about hell here, which I think is actually, an obstacle to faith for some people. And that is, if God is all good and all powerful, forget the fact that just bad things happen to good people, but what about people like Michael and me who've been struggling with these questions? It would seem kind of unfair if we had to suffer for eternity because we didn't believe after doing the best we could, living according to our lights. I find that a very troubling concept. Now, not all religions believe that, and people try to soft sell it and say, well, hell just means absence from God, it doesn't mean suffering. There's been a lot of stuff that's gone down in history about you're going to be burning and suffering for eternity unless you believe. So I find that troubling. I don't know if people here believe in hell. You do.
I find it terribly troubling.
And you believe in it.
Well, I don't know that, there's not enough description in the scriptures to know whether, there are 9 circles and that, they're ordered in a certain way. I know the New Testament scripture says there's gnashing of teeth. Sounds pretty bad, but, he says that...
It's fire and burning.
Right, he says, Lewis says, well, it just means separation from God, and that's, during your life, that's what you've tried to do. You've tried to turn away from God, not pay attention to him. And so in your afterlife, that's what you're going to get. And that's all there is. And that's really bad because who wants to be separated for eternity from their Creator?
Lewis makes the interesting description of life as being made up of decisions, and that every decision we make either draws us closer to the Creator or further away from him, and that we, in one sense, determine the direction where we end up in by how we make these decisions, how we live our life. Is it possible that Freud and Lewis represent conflicting parts of ourselves? A part of us that yearns for a relationship with the source of all joy, hope, and happiness, as described by Lewis. And another part that raises its fist in defiance and says, with Freud, I will not surrender. Whatever part we choose to express will determine our purpose, our identity, and our whole philosophy of life.
What are your views on love, morality, and suffering? Exchange views with others in our discussion forums and explore these subjects in greater depth with artists, scientists, writers, and thinkers at pbs.org.
A presentation of WGBH, Boston.
Funding for this program was provided by Lawrence Rockefeller, the John Templeton Foundation, the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation, the Paul Montrone Foundation, Tom and Gert Phillips, the ServiceMaster Company. Funding is also provided by these funders: This program was also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station by viewers like you. Thank you.